Good morning. We are on page 82 on 5694 Tzadik Daled. And this now corresponds with top of page 1149 in Ayin Beis. So what we learned yesterday was after the long explanation of the process of how Ratzon, how desire emerges and evolves from its early infancy of just being a stimulated consideration for a relationship with another outside of the etzem, and then turning into a deliberation that gives it some shape, general shape, and a determination, which then led to Ratzon Prati, which is specific details and the pursuit and being drawn toward the object of desire, which led to a Ratzon Kodum, which is, as we're going to learn in a moment, where you begin to allocate the resources and envision and the last steps before the Ratzon becomes a fully blown desire that is active and affecting whatever the object of the desire is going to be. So then the Frierdiker Rebbe went and said, so this is all a dogma from human resources, from human faculties and human experiences to understand Lamaila. And he gave us a little, like almost a half a page of what does that mean? That we understand from us, the human being, we could understand things in the divine level. And he said that though on one hand, our understanding is going to be limited because though we were created in a divine image, and from my flesh I behold God, the word is behold, erze. Erze is not ria, what he calls ria, rias, I'm just looking at the actual language. Ria chushis. Ria pnimis, museges, umurgeshes, mamish, beria chushis. So erze is a weaker form of discerning, of perceiving, of getting a glimpse. So on one hand, it's not ereh, and he gives a length. What means riyah? Riyah means you actually see something in the most tangible, palpable way. And said that's what happened when the Jewish people, 3 times a year, shalosh panim b'shana yirah, that they would go up to Yerushalayim to see and be seen. What did they see? They actually saw Lakus b'muchish. They saw it. They saw it in the physical world, in space, and also in all the natural things. And he gives one example. Well, first he says because the chumrius of the yeshus was dissolved and was nullified, and therefore you could see the real true mahus, the true personality of the natural existence, which is godliness. And he gave the example of emdim tzvufim mishtachrim revochim, where you see space and non-space joining, meeting, that they stood tight, and yet at the same time, when they bowed and they prostrated, they had space. So that's all riyah, not erze. That's ereh, riyah, not chezoyin. Chezoyin, he says, like a chezoyin laila is more like a dream-like state. It's more dreamy. So it's not quite as clear and focused. So even though that's correct, but yet, on the other end of it, we do get a sense, what we called yesterday, a glimpse, if you wish, a snapshot, a photo, an image. We do get an image at Selim. We said Salmenu, created in the image. We do get an image of events that are happening above. Earlier he said the word in the spheres, Patzuf Melyenim, Makifim, Pnimim. And now he continues even further up, all the way to the highest levels, even to the levels before the Tzimtzum. That's where we stopped. So now the stage is set. All the different qualifications. The qualifications, number one, that, the first thing we established what's going on in the human structure of how desire evolves and the whole process, from the etzem nefesh all the way to a full-blown desire. And now we've also qualified how our being is able to get a image of what is going up above, like a image, yeah. So now what is above? So now he's going and says that the three levels, he's starting with the first Ratzon. Remember, there are three levels of Ratzon: Ratzon Klali, Ratzon Prati, Ratzon Akadim. But the Frierdiker Rebbe, not Ayin Beis, the Frierdiker Rebbe added that in the level one, there's three steps. So that's what he begins with. He says, the line is on page 82, the line begins, the Erein Sof Shalifnei Tzimtzum. And if you need the text, just go to ayinbeis.com and the text is there, the PDFs of these pages. So he says, the Yeseiris HaKloli, which was the word he used also in the beginning. The Dugma Lamai, Yeseiris HaKloli means the general awakening or the general stimulation or the general inspiration. Meaning the initial Hiserudus for a Ratzon, he says, Hu Aheskem HaKloli. That is the general consideration. Remember, that's step one. A consideration whether there is room for another. What is that lamaila? He says, "Hu aheskem hakloli al elamis." The general consideration. And remember, consideration here doesn't mean that it may not happen. Consideration here means that it's just the beginnings of a process, and it doesn't have any tzir. That's what it means now. This is not the consideration of seichel, where there it can contradict or weaken the heskem, or not the theory, I should say. Here, the heskem klali al elamis. So what's happened here is that there's a beginning of a stage one, is that there's a general agreement. God agrees, so to speak, with himself in a conscious way, in the divine energy level, that the issue of a relation, that there'll be an existence of elamis. The fact is, I probably would not use consideration anymore in the nimshal. In the mashal, it works very well. You consider and then you weigh it and so on. Here, consideration can still be used, but it shouldn't be confused with a consideration that can be negated. This is more like the initial considering leaving. Is it something that I want to have? So you could say it's being agreeable to it. It's being his heskem, meaning he decides that he's going to consider. Because remember, it's not a determination on the lex level. So I'm looking for the right words. It's the first step of considering, relating to reality, to existence, to elamis.
Even by a human being, it's not being negated. It's consideration. It's a gram. The Shakla Vitari is even not if yes or not. So you could say the same thing about above also, that this is like a step.
That's a good point. It's a good point, correct. That's a good point, yeah. But fine, correct. Yeah, point well taken. You're right. But it's not like Shakvatari of Seichel. That's what in Seichel, it's not that way. In Ratzon, whether it's Lamato or Lamaila, correct. So the point being here that the real emphasis is, remember, the shift.
It's like Chachma of Ratzon, sort of. It's like a flash.
I would not use the word Chachma here at all because it's just going to confuse. Chachma is Seichel. But I know what you mean. I understand. You're saying it's just the first glimpse, the first stirring. Correct. In that sense, yes. I just would be careful to use the word chachma because then right away you say, 1 second, is it the seichel within Ratzon? But your point is, again, well taken. It means it's the first stirring, which is exactly what happens in seichel. Chachma is the first flash, as you said, yeah. But it's correct to say it that way. Now, why do we call it a consideration heskem? Because it's still removed, not because he's not going to determine. This stage, however, is not the determination stage. This is still a stage of the initial godliness, which is completely poshet, betachlis apshitus, completely shapeless and seamless and doesn't have any relationship with anything. You want that godly level of godliness involved. So in that level emerges the beginning of the Heskem Klali. The Heskem Klali. The general agreement to the idea of Ilmus. What's the next step? This is all still in Ratzon Klali. What's the next step? Hashakha v'taya. This we call the deliberation. Kav yochel, so to speak. Because obviously we're talking Lamaila, everything is so to speak. What is that? He says, Hu kamayim razal b'min nimlach. So the end of that is b'nishmesein shel tzadikim. That who did God consult? In other words, now we're not talking within the divine consciousness, the first stirring of considering relationship. He's now deliberating on it. So b'min nimlach is a so-called a consultation. Now, bear in mind, there are no neshamas yet, or tzaddikim. So you have to say b'min nimlach is what we learned earlier in Ayin Beis, minei ubei. He's envisioning the tzaddikim he would consult, so to speak. So consultation does not mean that he can't figure it out himself. It just means, b'min nimlach, it means that he is involving other forces as neshamas of tzaddikim in the process. Frierdiker Rebbe does not elaborate on this. We could elaborate and try to understand it deeper, but I would say, based on the Shakha V'tai, they said that Tzir Mefuret. Why you need this stage? Why can't God jump from a stirring to his own, giving it a tzir, and then moving it to determination? So I would suggest the reason is because the mere fact that he's interested in a relationship, that's also a good word, by the way, interest, even though it's not the right translation of Heskem, but it does show a like we said before, some Yerida. It's not atzmi, it's not poshet, it's not spashus, it's not pure It's not like a, I think a good example would be, I'm not sure if this is a good example, but when we talked about this example in the past, you project light, a projector of light to a screen. So what do you see? White light. White light has no shape, no form, nothing. It's just plain white light. Then you put a film between the projector and the screen, and what will happen? Images will begin to emerge. If you put letters, it'll be letters. The white light, the plain shapeless white light remains white light. It just now, you've added another ingredient. The reason I'm hesitant to use the example because it doesn't yet have that type of shape like a film would create. But the point I'm making is that it's moving from completely white light to some form of Heskem. And the next step is the liberation we learned was to give it tzir. He used the words nizgala klolis haprote hanirtze. So I would say, yesh leimer, you could say, consulting, so to speak, with the tzaddikim, which means God envisioning the tzaddikim that will be existent in existence, who will fulfill his desire for a dira b'tachtenim, that starts giving a tzir to the Heskem Klali. So of course God could have done it without tzaddikim. He didn't have to consult with anyone. Doesn't need nimlach. But the mere fact that he's now considering, it would be like the teacher. Remember we spoke about the teacher. He's sitting all on his own, learning. Doesn't need anyone. He's completely immersed. He has full pleasure. Everything is fine. If you asked him, would you consider give a class to others? You would just be disturbing him because he's busy, he's immersed. Just using it as an example. So that he's on his own. But then comes a point where he starts considering. He's not giving the class yet. He's not even developed the plan. He just now has moved and shifted. His state of mind or state of being is one, I'm ready to consider giving a class. Again, not a consideration that will be negated or weakened. It's just a process. He's moving from sitting completely alone and learning, and he's now moved that he is beginning to consider. But that's an early step. The next thing he envisions what the students, so that's b'min nimlach. Because what is the whole thing? It's a relationship with another. So the Shakvatari is beginning to give shape, general shape. Remember, we're not talking about the specifics of the desire, like what type of class and what mesechta or what sugya or what type of students. He's just envisioning the idea of a relationship that he's going to be teaching others. So step one, Heskim, remember the focus was on the Muhus HaNefesh, meaning the teacher has shifted. Step two is beginning to get shape. What is he shifting toward? What is this relationship about? And that will lead in a second, the Hachlota. So I think that's a good example. So what B'min Nimlach is. So B'min Nimlach is not just God decided to consult. That's exactly what he wants. He wants a relationship with another. So in a sense, he needs to consult with them. But here we don't have an actual other. So it has to be within himself. He's envisioning. It's like before you go on a date, you envision what the date would respond to you. That type of thing. Again, just a muscle kavyachol. You're not really actively involved in the relationship, but you're considering it. So then your next step is you say, okay, what would it be like to have a conversation with someone other than myself, so to speak, other? That I think is a good way to explain it. Okay.
And that's before time and space was created. With the whole
right,
everything.
For sure. Yeah. It's all, as I said, once you're lifting at Simsum, you're talking here that God is giving us a glimpse, an image, a photo of his own. He chose to make this process. Remember that. So it's all within himself without time and space. It's qualitative stages. Yeah. But what it does is it gives us something to hold on to, and it gives us something to emulate as we relate to God, because you can relate to God on the Heskim level, on the Shakavatari level, on the other levels, as we discussed. But these are the highest levels. It's going to for a real relationship, it's not enough for you to sit in your room and envision what your students are like, or what it means to have students. You need to actually go do it. And then comes Uba Ba'achlota, then it comes into a determination. Shahu Ratzon HaKlali. The who is not referring to Achlota alone. I believe it's referring to all three. Or you could say the determination, remember, is a result of the liberation and the consideration. So you could touch it two ways. Based on what he said, Ratzon Klali seems to be all three. Remember, Heskimi called the Haschala of the Ratzon Klali, Hachloti called the Sof of the Ratzon Klali. So it's clearly, but you could technically say, at the end of the day, once the determination is made, the determination carries within it the Heskim and the Shakavatariya. So it's not three disjointed stages. There's no determination if there wasn't the first two. So at the end of the day, this is a process that leads now to what? To Hachlota, Shuratzon HaKlali. So what do we have? The Hachlota means it's no longer just the first step of the nefesh or in the etzema, the oir, moving toward relationship. It's not just a general image of it. It's now solidified into a determination of creation. So Elokus has now taken on, I don't want to say the word shape, but it's taken on a particular desire. However, here comes next step. Aval, ein bezeh adayin rotzon klal. I'm sorry, rotzon mamish. Lifel hadavar. As much as this was a shift from the early stages of shapelessness, it's still not a rotzon mamish. Lifel hadavar. It's a determination that it's worthy, and this is desired, and it's a determination that is solidified. But it's not a rotzon mamish. Lifel hadavar. To activate. If you remember the idea of actively activate it into actually the Ratzon actually going in toward the process of creation. The Ratzon Prati, where does that happen? This activation, he says, the Ratzon Prati. Next step. Hu shenis'erer kavyachol beratzon be'elamis. And now he's been stimulated or awakened so to speak, for a Ratzon Elamus. Now you'll say, 1 second, didn't we just say that in stage 1? So he's going to qualify. The Hainu, not just the Ratzon Elamus in the Heskim, Shakvatari, and Hachlota of the Ratzon Kloli. The Hainu, but Ratzon bizgalus batzmusei is baruch, lias Elamus bepeil. So till now, it's really been all within, so to speak, the godly consciousness, a process of moving toward the possibility of a relationship. He's now moved toward that, given it some general shape, like the teacher envisioning somewhat the what does it mean, a relationship, and coming to determination, yes. But you can't call it an active desire. Remember, we didn't even want to call it Ratzon, he called it Machshava, because it's not doing anything, right? If it stopped right there, it would all be within the divine consciousness, these early steps. But you don't have the steps necessary to activate it. In the human, it's very clear. You actively, for many years, this can remain dormant. And then you go ahead and you start pursuing the building of a home or creating art, or the case of the teacher, actively going and saying, okay, let's put together a class. I'm desiring it in a very specific way. So basically what he's saying is the Ratzon Klali is the genesis and the seeds within Elokus, but it's not his galus. Relatively speaking, you can't call it his galus because it's not yet relating to existence on the terms of existence. It's relating to existence on the terms of God. What a relationship means to me.
It's like the end is wedged in the beginning. He's like looking for a chavrusa. At the end of it, the ultimate thing is when we're able to be tzaddikim and the chavrusas for the Eibusha. That's the first thing he did. He consulted. He had a. It's unbelievable when you think of it like that.
Yeah.
It's like we said before that in Ratzon Klali, it's not shayches to other things. It's only hazozo be'atzmusoi. So only in Ratzon Prati, it's coming closer to the Olamas.
Absolutely. He actually said that earlier as well. But the subtle difference is that why I have to elaborate, because if you remember, he said earlier that the Heskim misyaches ala nefesh and the Achlota misyaches al dover hamuskim. So subtly, in the first level of Ratzon Klali, the Achlota does relate to the general idea of a relationship. But a general idea of a relationship is not an active desire for the relationship. It's all in the state of in considering, determining, but all on the level of the Ratzon Klali. So if you understand it and it's clear, I don't have to elaborate more. But if you think about it, you need a little more explanation. What's the difference between being agreeable and giving a general shape to the state that we're talking? In the human, it's very clear. The first one is stationary, can remain in its place and it never goes into an active pursuit. Lamaila, you have to say, it's God relating to existence on existence terms. So therefore, he's actively now pursuing the Oyed, and the Ratzon is now what he's going to call Aliyas HaRatzon. Until now, you don't call it Aliyas HaRatzon. Look at the next line now. So what do we have? Sheneser kavrachem beratzon be'elamus. The hainu beratzon bizgalus. In atzmus is baruch is bizgalus. Lias elamus bepeil. And remember, all this is still Ratzon. It's not creation yet. In Ratzon, he says, V'hu inyan aliyas haratzon al elamus. This level now, Ratzon Prati, is when you say aliyas haratzon the bezeh itmar. And this is what we learn. Kisha'ola b'retzene yizbarach lahaitzel ulivrei esa elamus. When arose in God's desire, when did it arise? So not the level of Heskim, you can't even call that arising. This is called now arising in his Ratzon to impart, to emanate, and to create the worlds. I think I have another example that may be very helpful here as well. It's all, of course, an example. Remember we spoke about machshava and dibur machshava. We spoke that machshava sheba machshava, the thought of thought, the speech within thought. Then you have the thought within speech and the speech within speech. So you could perhaps say something like this, that the first level of Ratzon Klali is the thought within thought. In other words, it's the thought of the relationship, and that has three levels. You consider beginning, the general shape, like I said with the teacher, and the termination, the end of that. All machshava shemachshava. But even within, but you don't have dibur machshava yet, which means you definitely don't have dibur to another. That we're not even discussing. Even within yourself, you've not given it any, you have not begun preparing the actual words. In other words, the details of what this desire is. In the context of the example, you've determined that you want a home, but you haven't talked about what kind of home, what will be made of, how many rooms, the details of it. So Ratzon Prati is when now, that this determination that I've had is now going to be translated into an active pursuit, an active being drawn with the specifics, like he says. And that I would say is like dibur sheba machshava, because it's still a machshava. Remember, it's still lifnei at tzimtzum, and it's still on the levels of rotzen. We're not talking about actually creating, which will come after the tzimtzum. So I just thought that may be the two levels within the machshava. But they're very far apart, because one he calls is not even a rotzen mamish, and the other one ola b'ritzeinei.
It's like we said before about by the Heskem, there's not even a Metzius Samahus, but by the end of the Heskem, when it comes to the Achlota, then it's Metzius Samahus.
Yeah.
What's important is Mahus Metzius.
Exactly. Yeah. And this would also stem with Benin Nimlach in a way. No, I'm sorry. No, it wouldn't. No. I was going to say Benin Nimlach is like Dibur Sheba Machshava. But the way I use the example is not that way. But you could say that way as well. You could say Heskim is like Machshava Shemachshava, but Min Nimlach Shalka V'Tayr is Dibur Shemachshava, and maybe the Hachlota is like Maisa Shemachshava. That becomes, like you said, Metzias Samahus, maybe. Okay. Level 3 now. The Ratzon HaKodem. What is the Ratzon HaKodem that follows the Ratzon HaPrati? Hu inyan, this is the inyan mashashir ba'atzmei kavyochel kol ma she'osid liyas bepeil. Mashashir. So we've used different words: envisioning, allocating, estimating. They're all accurate in different ways, and I don't have a preference. I like to use mostly envisioning and allocating. Estimating, even though shir really is estimating, it's like a contractor that estimates how much wood will I need to build a house, let's say of 3,000 square feet. So shir atzmei, he like measures in a way.
Estimation is not the exact.
Yeah, but that's why I don't like the word estimation, because it's approximate. But if you say it's measuring, it's like, let's say he measures the room or the house and says, I will need for this, I will need 100 pieces of wood. So that's what Shir Asmei B'Keach is. God is now preparing and allocating and
vision, maybe not sure.
Well, let me explain what I'm saying. If Ratzon Prati, like he said, is thinking about the what the materials you're going to use. He said like ofar, eitzim, avonim, wood, stone, wood, earth, how many rooms, what furniture will go in there. So the Shir Asmei B'Keach is the state where you actually prepare the materials to fulfill the Ratzon Prati. Now, in an artist, it works very nice. Once the artist has made the determination, then he moves into, okay, so what type of art am I going to create? Is it going to be a horizon? Is it going to be a portrait? Is it going to be a war? That's Ratzon Prati. He's thinking of the details and he's actively in a state of movement toward painting. Shir Atzmei B'Keach, Ratzon Kodem would be where he actually now goes to tool chest and prepares all the canvas and the colors and the paintbrushes and all the resources he will need for it. So in general, if you remember, we spoke about two levels of Ratzon Klali, Ratzon Prati, Ratzon, remember the previous mimer. But if you break it down, the Ratzon Kodum becomes a level within after the Ratzon Prati. So that's why it's a little subtle, because you could say, when you're envisioning what you need for the art, is that Ratzon Prati or is it Ratzon Kodum? So I would answer, if it's the envisioning of the details, period, it's more Ratzon Prati. But if it's envisioning in order to be able to gather the right resources you need to fulfill that, that's more Ratzon Kodum. That's why it's not so black and white, because at the end of the day, remember, all stages are needed. The question, when does it move from Ratzon Prati to Ratzon Kodum? That's not easy to answer, because they overlap, obviously. Because once you finish, let's say you've envisioned in Ratzon Prati, I know exactly what kind of house I want. I want it to be 3,000 square foot. I want 20 rooms, 5 rooms. I want this color, that color, etc., etc. And you stop there, you haven't reached the next step. You need the resources. You have to go prepare the materials that you need. Obviously, here we're not talking about Gashmizdika materials, but we're talking, let's say, Esesfiris. So in the Ratzon Prati, you come to the point, it's not just that you want a relationship. It's going to be in the form of Esesfiris. But Esesfiris can remain defined Chachma Bina Dat. The Ratzon Kodem, the Shir Atzmei B'Keach, actually says, so what will I need for Chachma? What will I need for Bina? And that will then become the defining blueprint by which, with its Tzimtzum and the Kav, you'll actually paint it. The Kav is the paintbrush. But the step before using a paintbrush is you need to have your resources with you. You know, like any worker has to bring the materials. So I'm just pointing out that it's not going to be easy to exactly define where one stops, where one, but we have the general parameters, and I think it's pretty clear. That's why the Shir Atzmei B'Keach is very clearly, yes, he's allocating, he is preparing. I said, I don't like the word approximate or estimate. You don't have to say that. You could say Shir Atzmei, he measures. Shir also from the word measure. Shir, he measures how much he needs, what he needs. You could also say that. Anyway, as I said, I don't have an exact, not if we had to translate this word for word, we have to find the right word, but you have to explain it. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just remember, not every word in Hebrew has an exact English word that translates it. Rav Shlomo Mishor will confirm that. You know, Mamal Kalaman. Yeah, you could say fills all the world. Because Hebrew.
Yes and no.
No,
I understand what you're saying.
Look, when I say the word, for example, let me ask you, Hergish Pnimi. Can you give me 2 exact words in English? That's Hergish Pnimi. Inner feeling. I understand, but it's not, doesn't capture what you mean by that. Look, when we translate, and I've worked, of course, in this, obviously we need to look for words. You look for a word, but if you really want to convey the spirit to a reader or to a learner, you need to explain the word. Mamala kalalma literally means to fill all the worlds. If you write that in a sentence, most people don't know what you're talking about. What it means, fill all the worlds. What's fill all the worlds? You have to explain. It's the divine energy that's tailored to each part of existence. Anyway, no need to elaborate. I just wanted to point out that we try to find as many words as we can. Even oir, you see I struggle. Even oir, is it energy or is it light? It's not that simple because it's oir, it depends. It really means both. It's a light that happens to be an energy. So that's a divine energy that energizes the world. You could say the light. But my point is, it's not semantics. It's not just finding a word. It's finding a word that conveys the spirit. I have no problem using 10 words to explain one word if necessary. Why not? We're learning this. Why shouldn't we? To try to make it as clear as possible. Okay. I would say using the muscle with dibra machshava, you could say when you're preparing, after you have a clear idea, and now you're preparing to present it to someone else, like a speech or a class. So you could see there's stages. One would be that you're now beginning to say, okay, here are the ideas I'm going to convey in my class for 1 hour. Okay. But then, do you have the exact words you're going to say? Not necessarily. Now, how are you going to open up? Dear students, what is going to be there? So there's another stage where you could actually be preparing the words that you're going to be saying before you actually say them. So I'm just pointing out that in any process, there's a more general, you know what the message you want to say, and then there's what exact words, like I said, with allocating resources. What words are you going to use exactly? What mashalim? I could tell you as a speaker, as a teacher, sometimes I know the general what I want to say, but I'm not necessarily so defined what mashal I'm going to use. I know I have several options, and then sometimes something comes to you while you're speaking. My point is that from getting from a klal to a prat, like Ratzon Klali to Ratzon Prati, we talked about. But I'm talking about from Ratzon Prati till Ratzon HaKodim, till you actually do it, there are steps of as well as you prepare yourself. Now, sometimes someone you could see didn't skip Shir Atzmei B'Kayach. They didn't prepare that well. That doesn't mean they can't convey an idea, but it will not be quite as precise. You know, I've talked to artists who told me sometimes you stand by the canvas and everything you planned for doesn't actually work out. So in other words, so I say, is that probably because you didn't have the proper Shir Atzmei B'Kayach? Like in other words, you didn't, or sometimes there's an inspiration that happens afterwards. Obviously, Lamaila, it's not that way because God is pretty much, can envision quite well what he wants. But nevertheless, the Shir Atzmei B'Kayach solidifies the actual resources you will need. So now, once that stage is set, you can imagine that once that Tzimtzum comes, which of course conceals all this, so allows for an independent consciousness, remember, relationship to emerge, and the Kav is informed by all these levels. All these levels, he doesn't say this explicitly, but if you want to really, it's very geschmack, and very to envision that the Kav, which is the divine light, the like the paintbrush, the stylus, is going to carry all the messages that all these levels, Shir Atzmei B'Kayach, informed by Ratzon Prati, informed by Ratzon Klali, is all translated now into this paintbrush that will give us the whole picture, including Makifim and Primim, as we learned. So the bottom line is, what we've discussed now is really the stage that's set of all these levels. So now we can begin the actual creation process. But this is not the creation process, this is the desire process from the earliest stages of all the way to a Ratzon Kodem. That's why it's called Kodem, because it's the Ratzon right before the next step of a Ratzon Goli that's going to activate the rest of the Shtalshlos, or activate the Tzimtzum and everything that comes afterwards. Okay.
Rabbi Jacobson.
Yes.
This whole Shir Atzmei B'Kayach that's going on here, preparing the material, so to speak, is that happening in the Yesh Amiti or the Ayin Be'emsa? In the Or in the Ma'or?
Everything is in the Ayin Be'emsa.
Everything's happening here is by Ayin Be'emsa?
Absolutely.
So then why do we
Because you
call
don't have, in Yesh Amiti, you don't have gradations. You can't talk about levels. He made that very clear. If you go back,
wow.
if you go back to page,
That's the purpose of the oil.
exactly.
Yeah.
I'd refer you back to page 51 in Sadik Daled, or
Yes.
47 in Ayin Beis. That's the whole beginning begins with that, making that statement that this is why we have the Ayin and the in the first place.
And that's page 51, you said? Okay.
51 and 1147 in Ayin Beis. Yeah, 51.
So why do we call it Ayin then? Because there's so much going on in there. Why would we refer it to as Ayin?
I would listen. You're asking questions that we learned about for hours and hours. This is all discussed. You're coming in the middle of the story here. I'm not criticizing. I'm just pointing it out.
I understand.
All discussion, all this is coming to explain what the ayin is about.
I understand, but why would they use it? Why is the term ayin, which
What do you
means
think the
nothing?
word ayin means?
I would generally call for it as nothing.
But that's not what it means. That's the point. Ayin does not mean. When we say yesh ma'ayin, is it created from nothing or created by God?
It's created from God, right?
Why do we
Yesh
call it ayin?
It's because it's something that we can't fathom.
So it's not, the word is not nothing. It's something that's mysterious. We can't fathom.
I see. I got you now. Okay, clear now. Thank you.
And
I was
then
struggling
there's
with that the whole
ayin from
time,
the
of
word
course.
bittul.
Now I understand. Now I understand the whole. I was wondering about that the last couple of days. Why is it called ayin? But now I understand. It's not ayin nothing. It's ayin that's unfathomable to us.
Right. And then there's ayin also as bittul. The higher level, remember the ayin has two levels? You're aware of that?
Yes, ayin.
So there's the ayin of yesh hanivra is unfathomable. The ayin of yesh hamiti is bittul. It's completely nullified in the presence of its source. That's why there it's called ayin. But yes, we're talking here basically how atzmus, the yesh hamiti, has now chosen to express himself through a metzias nimtza called Ur. There's a field of energy, like a type of reflection of Atzmus. And within that Ur, all this is happening, all these levels that we're discussing.
Got it. Thank you. That clarified. Thank you.
If you go a bit earlier, you'll learn there's Etzema Ur, Atzmi, Spashtus Ur. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Just since we're on it, I'll just make sure that you must remember one thing. I'm saying this to everybody. Ur does not mean another entity outside of Atzmus. It means that it's not Atzmus, but it's nothing but Atzmus, because all it does is reflect its source in the highest levels. And then lower levels, it begins to manifest what God wants it to manifest, which is a connection and to a relationship, which is what we're learning now, a Ratzon, and the Ratzon goes through all these stages, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, remember, even after the Ratzon HaKodum, and you're ready to create existence, it's still Ur. It's all within Ur. This is not like an independent forces that are at work before the Tzimtzum. It's all Ur Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, which is the next line. V'akolhu ba Ur Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. I'm continuing to read. Second line from the bottom, 82. All this is Ur Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, because that's the field of energy. That's why I call it a field of energy. Think of it like a quilt. It's a quilt of energy. A quilt just as a muscle. It's a field of energy. Atzmos and Yesh Hamiti, you can't call anything like that. Doesn't have any definitions. This is a field of divine energy. Within this field, you have elements. Now, if you're familiar a bit with some of the quantum theory, it's very much one of the theories, string theory and other theories that explain the intrinsic unity of existence is there are no real particles. It's not like, how do atoms and subatomic particles sense billions of miles away faster than the speed of light? Because they say in truth, everything is one field of energy upon which was impressed a structural elements that we can convince ourselves that existence is all about fragmented pieces. In truth, it's only one quilt upon which was impressed many details. It's almost like what I said before about a field of light from a projector, white light, and upon it we're impressing details. But it's not intrinsic, it's not inherently detail oriented. It's really oneness. Oneness in the shape of different forms. So that just as a muscle. Going back here, if you want to envision Lifnei Tzimtzum as best as we can, and he said only a dugma, etc., think of it like a complete white light where there's no impressions, and within that, God is sending messages that he wants. It's all his Ratzon. I want to have a Ratzon Heskem, and I want to have a Shakavitaria, B'min Nimlach, and I want to have a Achlota, then I want a Ratzon Prati, and then I want a Ratzon HaKodum. So all this, I mean, I'm saying God's will, I'm using will here in a loose way because Ratzon itself is a level. But essentially, it's God's interest through the Ur to manifest all these aspects. And if you were to exist Lifnei Tzimtzum, all you'd see is divine consciousness, divine. That's why we discussed at length the Rebbe's letter. Lifnei Tzimtzum, in truth, it's all within one field. called Eir Ein Sof. However, in the Eir Ein Sof, God wanted us to have handles which to hold on to. So he's giving us so-called the specifics, kavyachol. But in truth, you can't call them specifics. You don't even have a building yet. You don't have a structure yet. There was no tzimtzum yet, conceptually. Now, the interesting thing, which is going to be hard to wrap our head around, since this is all the Ma'alim Mizman and Mokim, so how do we explain? Right now, we have the level of Er Atzmi and Ispashtus Er and Heskim and Shakavitari and Achlota and Ratzin Prati and Ratzin Kod, and then Tzimtzum and Kav. All this is happening all the time. So that's going to be a little difficult to understand. How does, once time and space emerges, how do we connect that back to a place that's beyond time and space? But that, I'm happy to have a conversation on that, but that needs a little more, a lot more in abstract thinking, because it's almost impossible to fully imagine it, because we are part of time and space. So it's hard for us to imagine how something is time and space at the same time higher than time and space. I mean, he did use the mashal with but that doesn't mean we could understand it. If I was standing right now with all of you and we're all crushed, tzvufim, we're all tight. What was the word I used before? Yeah, whatever. We're all tight together, and then suddenly it comes to mishtachmim. Each of us has space. What would we say to each other if that happened? We'd say, "What's going on here? It's very weird." You know, it's very hard to imagine the two at the same time. Without the room emptying, how does everybody bowing and having space to bow when there's no room to stand? Anybody have any thoughts on that? I guess it's a quantum-like state, frankly, where two things are happening at once that are makom and bli makom. But it's very difficult to imagine in reality. And yet it happened. Even in 770, the best times when we were crushed, I don't think we were able to do that. Were we? I don't remember. How did they fall? When the shul was packed like sardines. Any scientific theories on that? Okay. I see I silenced you all. When it comes to explaining this, it's not so simple, right? Good. So v'akol hu ba'er ein sof shel lifnei hatzimtzum. All this that we discussed in the ein sof lifnei hatzimtzum. And the Frierdiker Rebbe continues. Let me just point out, I've said I would point this out. The last 5 lines that we learned, 6 lines, is word for word from Ayin Beis, top of page 1149. So just be aware of that. And now the Frierdiker Rebbe adds some explanation, but then he's going to go back to the language of Ayin Beis with further explanation. So he says like this. All this is the Eir Lifnei HaTzimtzum, the Bechlaluse. This Eir Lifnei HaTzimtzum in general, Hainu Klalus Eir Shel Lifnei HaTzimtzum in general, which means this Eir, this light or energy or field of energy, Pre-Tzimtzum, Hu Eir HaKol Ba'atzmusei Kanal. In general, this is the level that's called Eir HaKol Ba'atzmusei. Now, you may recall a previous class where I explained what that means. Didn't we say earlier that Eir Kol Ba'atzmusei is the Shmoy HaKadmin, is the Eir that's not even an Eir because it's the Chelis of Hashem? Didn't we say that is okay? That's a very deep level, high level. Didn't we say Eir Kol Ba'atzmusei is Eir Atzmi, that doesn't even have a Rotzen yet, doesn't have anything? And now he says Lifnei HaTzimtzum is generally Eir Kol Ba'atzmusei. So I explained at length, at least in 1 or 2 classes. This is back to the Rebbe's letter on the topic in Tafshin Tes. 1949, the Rebbe wrote a very relevant letter about this, that generally speaking, if you talk in general terms, all of Eir Lifnei HaTzimtzum is Kol Ba'atzmusei. What does that mean? Because it's all focused on what Atzmus wants. That's all that matters. It doesn't yet have really a function outside of the Atzmus consciousness. After the Tzimtzum, it begins to have functionality in that sense. That's one thing the Rebbe says. We mentioned the example with mitzvahs, that no matter what type of mitzvah, you do it with the same passion, whether it's a kal or chamura, a lenient mitzvah or a severe mitzvah. Why? Because Ratzon Hashem is equal in all of that. The Rebbe's first answer, I gave now the second, deeper answer. The first answer he gives, that it's all relative. Compared to after the Tzimtzum, before the Tzimtzum is Er Kol Batz Musay, it's all poshet, it's all shapeless. But compared to Atzmus, everything outside of Atzmus is already at least two things, it and its source. So relatively speaking, he says here, the next words, it's all Er Kol Batz Musay. Rak de Be'er Zeh Gufa, in this Er itself, Yesh Beis Madreges. Page 83. I'll explain in a minute the Beis Madreges. So the point being, you have to keep in mind, which is very common in Chassidus, and we've learned this many times. Someone says, Atzilus is Elokus. Bria is already the beginning of a Yesh. But then you suddenly learn that in Bria, Elokus is Begoli. So then you start saying, 1 second, is Bria Elokus and Yitzira is more Yesh? The answer is it's all relative. Atzilus compared to Bia is considered Elokus. Iyu v'chayu echad, iyu v'garmu echad. But compared to higher than Atzilus, Atzilus is a structure. It has Chochmah and Bina and Das and Chesed and Gvura. So you have to always keep in mind, and that's why in Chassidus you find, especially in Ayin Beis, the Rebbe Rashab, he'll say Elokus, and then he'll say Elokus Mamish. And the first time you read it, what does that mean? And what, the first Elokus was not Mamish? Yeah, Chelik Elokam and Mal Mamish. The word Mamish has a lot of significance. It means, it's basically telling us, not that the other one is not a Elokus, but it's all relative. If you're talking about Mamish, meaning the utter ultimate, is one level. If it's not Mamish, means, yes, in general it is, but it's now already moved down a level. Then there are things you don't call Elokus at all. You can't call, for example, a Yesh HaChumri, you don't call it Elokus. You create, that God created it. It reflects Mitziusim Atzmusei. But you don't call the hide of an animal a mitzvah or Elokus until you turn it into cloth, film, the mezuzah or sefer Torah. So my point is that things have names, but sometimes it's mamish, sometimes not mamish, sometimes ke'ein. So you just have to keep that in mind.
You can't say atzmos and atzmos mamish, can we?
No, you could actually. What you would say is, you could say atzmusei baruch can very often refer to erei sof lifnei atzimtzum. He won't use atzmusei baruch mamish. You're right. He will say bilta mitzias nimtza or mitziusim atzmusei or mechuyev mitzias. The word mamish won't usually be used that way, but it will be used in other, like we said, ela kol batzmusei mamish, and then he says er kol batzmusei, doesn't use the word mamish. These are just words that are important to understand how they're being used, to understand what they're trying to convey. Remember, one of the first rules in learning these things is that words are always inadequate. They're kalim that are never going to fully capture the spirit of what's being said. That's why we learn it. If you just read the words and you don't get, there are things that are subtleties, just like reading a book, lahavdil. There's the words, but then there's the spirit. And many people, two people read the same page and they're reading two different stories. Why? Because one person gets it. They get the in between the lines, the spirit, the mood, and some people convey it well in words and some don't. This is all part of the process to remember that, that's why it's important to keep talking about it and personalizing it with examples back and forth till you really get a sense. Because at the end of the day, I always say, this is not a mathematical equation. This isn't a course in spiritual mechanics, where you know where all the pipes are and all the springs and all the joints, etc. It's not that at all. This never will be mechanical. Even though you could make a map of this on a piece of paper, but like I said then, the story, like the Rebbe said about those college students, so they have a paper Rebbe now. So basically you could describe Lifnei Atzimtzum on paper. So what you'll have is a Lifnei Tzimtzum on paper. It's not the spirit. You need to find ways to identify. We need to find ways to identify with these levels within ourselves in some way, or else it becomes just an exercise in academic mind games, which can be very profound and very enriching, but it's not bringing the point home. Okay. So now we're talking in the Eir HaKol Batzmusei, which is Lifnei Tzimtzum. He's now going back to what he began with. If you remember Eir. Let me just see where he began this. This was back, I mentioned, page 51. Yeah. Now, interesting, Eir Atzmi and Eir HaMispashet was not used in Tzadik Daled yet. The only reason we talked about it because it was an Ayin Beis, and we learned Ayin Beis ahead of Tzadik Daled. Now we're catching up. The last few lines of this paragraph is where we stopped in Ayin Beis, and we're going to return then. So he says, I'm going to read this quickly because, he says like this. In this Eir itself, there's two levels. Etzem Eir, Vispashtus Eir. The core of the energy and the extension of the energy. The Vispashtus Eir hu b'chinas hamshacha v'gili. You know what? I have a better idea. Because I want to explain it, I think we should stop here. I was going to just read it quickly, and then I realized, let's get it better clear. And we'll do that on Sunday. We'll finish this paragraph, and then we'll go back to Ayin Beis, and we'll compare. We'll be good. But basically, he's now going back to explain the levels Lifnei Tzimtzum, how actually works. So he's really summing up all this whole map that we talked about, that process, Lifnei Tzimtzum, before the Tzimtzum, what stages, the Eir, Spashtus Eir, then he's going to go into the Rotzen. And he's going to go back to concluding the two levels of Ayin. This is going to be the first explanation of how we understand the two levels of Ayin. So I think this is a good place to stop. Yeah, we'll stop at the top, bottom of 82, top of 83, page 83.